everyone. On this impossible shot, we are going to look at how to do screen inserts right. This is one of the most common effects done in visual effects by editors, motion graphic artists, and effects artists, and it's also one of the effects that's commonly done badly. It doesn't need to be that way. The first problem is actually during production. Stop shooting green screen. Seriously. People somehow think they have to shoot screen inserts with a green screen. Nothing could be worse for the most case. The only time you really want to shoot a green screen on a screen insert is if you have the actor's hair getting between the camera and the screen. If it's just fingers or other simple objects, that's much easier to roto or luma key out. And by keeping a black screen, you end up preserving the reflections that you want to add back to make the illusion that glass is going back over the top of your insert. Finally, don't go to the other extreme and shoot a completely black screen. If you don't have any detail around the edges, you need to add at least some very tiny markers so that you have something to latch onto. Now, you'll have to paint them out, but that's not as big a deal as having nothing but reflections to try to track, because you can't track reflections. Okay, today we're going to do this in After Effects. Let's dig right in and see the process of actually making a realistic screen insert. Alright, so here we are in After Effects. We have our layer. Now all I've done is gone ahead and applied the Mocha plugin by choosing Animation, Track in Boris FX Mocha. And now if I click on the Mocha button in the Effects tab, here I am in Mocha ready to track. Now I cheated and went ahead and already created a garbage mat just for when the finger comes and intercepts with the screen. So that's the only thing I've done. Very simple. You can watch out Mocha Survival Guide if you want to learn more about how to use these techniques. Now that we've got that in place, I'm going to go to the frame when the phone is pretty much dead on to camera, and I'm going to create the actual tracking shape that we're going to use to track. I'm going to zoom in here and use my X-spline tool, and I don't want to include any of the reflected surface of the phone. There's nothing useful for Mocha to track in there, and the reflections are actually reflecting something that isn't part of the rigid body we're trying to track, so it's going to throw the tracker. So what I'm going to do is make kind of a hollow shape here. I obviously want to include my tracking markers, and I also want to include the outline of the phone because that's good tracking information. And I don't really care if I track some of the fingers here because even though they're not technically in the same perspective plane, they're not really moving, and because Mocha tracks from one frame to the next and not from a reference frame on, it should accommodate the slight changes as that goes through. So I'm going to go up here, and what I'm going to do is just leave a gap there and come back around to get the edge of the phone. So essentially here I'm creating kind of an inverted C of the area we want to track and nothing more. Okay, I right click to close out the shape. All is done. Most importantly, I need to pull this down below the garbage mat, otherwise it won't register the garbage mat as an area to ignore. Call this iPhone, and I'll track 100% of pixels because it's a small area, and I'll also turn on perspective tracking because it does change in perspective. I'm going to track back to the start, then move back to the first frame of the track and track to the end. So for Nuke with its concatenating corner pins, this is all we need to do. But in Fusion, and more particularly for this tutorial After Effects, we actually need to create this guy, which is the planar surface, which is ultimately the area that will be corner pinned inside of After Effects. So what we're going to do is we're going to check for drift as well. And so from frame 22 to about frame 4, we have this pretty radical shift in perspective. So let's actually start at frame 22. I'm going to turn off my other elements so they don't obstruct the screen, turn on the planar surface, and make sure my magnifier is on. So now I can see and position with these green markers in mind. There we go. And I'll go to Adjust Track and click Set Master All. And now I'm going to go back to frame 4 and take a look at each track, and you'll see that there's been a shift for sure. So I'm going to try auto, and it actually does guess pretty well. Try that for this guy. That lines nicely. Maybe we'll just go halfway between and do another quick alignment. And then we'll check halfway between those. Okay, and that should just fix any of that drift from crazy motion blur. So with all the correction done, the last little step, which is most important for After Effects and Fusion to make sure that we have plenty of room to corner pin, is to click this guy here, which sets the planar surface to the extremes. And I'm doing this at the reference frame that I want, frame 16 here. And that will just make sure we have plenty of resolution to scale down into back in After Effects. Now that we're done with the tracking, what we want to do is go in and actually test to make sure that the tracking was solid. And the easiest way to do that is to simply stabilize the footage so we can see if the phone truly stays locked. So let's take a look at that. We're going to go into the effects for this layer. In fact, I'm going to duplicate the layer. Control D to duplicate, hit Enter to rename, and I'm going to call this Stabilize. And now in the tracking data section of the Mocha plugin, I'm going to say I want to invert the data because we're stabilizing, not match moving. And I want to export a corner pin to my stabilized layer and then apply the export. Now I set as a reference frame frame 16 back in Mocha. That's where I set master for the adjustment track. So this frame should stay locked in its position and all the other frames should move around to accommodate. So now that I've done that, I'm going to just play back a RAM preview. And what we want to do is confirm that that phone is locked hard and solid. And the easy way to do that is just put your mouse pointer over each of the markers here and confirm that there's no real drift at any point or any hiccups. If there is even the slightest drift or the slightest bump at any frame, it will show in horrific ways when you actually go to do the screen insert. So you want to make sure that every single marker is set, and if you see any kind of bump or movement, you need to go back into Mocha and readjust. Otherwise, it won't be until it's on a massive 4K projector in front of a client that you suddenly realize that the thing is messed up. Much better to figure that out now and fix it, or you'll notice it later. Okay, our next step is to remove these ugly tracking markers before we get started applying the graphic to the top. So I'm going to select the stabilized layer. We're going to paint on the stabilized version. We're going to paint at frame 16 just to keep things simple because that's the original source frame. And we need to double click the layer to actually open the layer window as its own pane. That's just one of the quirks of working with the paint tool. And I'm going to use the clone stamp tool here in After Effects. And we'll go to the brushes palette over here. And I'm going to select maybe a 35 soft brush. So I want a reasonably large brush, maybe a little bit larger actually, we'll go 45. And I also want it to be nice and soft so that when the reflections pass through, there's a little bit of fall off and not any nasty hard edges that really give away the fact that we're cloning some of the reflection from elsewhere. Then we also need to go into the paint and make sure it's at the normal duration constant because we want the paint to work across time and not just at the current frame. And that should do it. So we're going to alt-click in the clone source, which we'll do just above and in a little from the marker, and then we'll just gently, now I'm on 4K here, so it takes a while to update, so I've got to be a little gentle so don't overdo it. And we want to make sure that we're fairly generous with the area so it doesn't reappear at a later frame. Okay, one thing that can sometimes happen is you'll see that the paint actually is being applied before the corner pin, and this needs to actually be after. We want the corner pin to be in place and then to paint on top of that. So let's just move that down And we'll check now and make sure that the paint's working for other frames. And it does seem to be. And you'll see that we get a little bit of a kind of a divot here in the reflection because we're simply copying from here up to here. But once the image is over the top, the audience is never going to notice that. If it does, one of the options you can do is do a 50% paint clone from this direction over here, and that'll blend it a little bit and make it more natural. You can also look at expanding the size of the brush to make a bigger area and fade it in more. But for this shot, no one's going to be able to see the difference. One thing you will notice is that we have our 4 clone brushes here. Because we started painting at frame 16, their endpoint currently is frame 16. So I just need to select all of those and drag the endpoint all the way back to frame 0. With the painting done, I'm going to switch back to the regular select tool so I don't accidentally paint extra brush strokes. And I can close out the layer view and just look at the actual composite. And there it is. The problem right now we have is that the footage is still stabilized. So if we look at all the other frames, the phone is staying still and everything else is moving around. One thing we could do, which is actually the wrong thing to do, but we could just apply a reverse corner pin after the paint work. And so I could come in here and I could say export corner pin. I'll deselect the invert, so I'm no longer inverting the data. And basically I'm going to reverse the first corner pin. So I apply it to this stabilized layer again. I'm just going to apply a second corner pin. There you have it. And it looks like everything's great. We've brought the footage back and all looks good. The markers are painted out. We're good to go. However, if you take a look, let me just zoom this to 200%. Have a look at the softness of the footage here. And remember I duplicated the layer. So if I deselect this layer and show the original footage, it might be a little hard to see, but there's some significant sub-pixel softening. Let me find something a little bit more in focus, like the fingers here. See how much softer they are when I turn on this layer. This is the original. This is the result. So we really never want to damage the entire image by softening everything. The solution is, what we really should do is only comp in the areas where we've replaced the markers. So the rest of the footage is the original source, and the only part that we're replacing in the footage is the part where we've cloned out the markers. So let's have a look at how to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to pre-compose this stabilized layer. So I'm going to select it, Control-Shift-C for pre-compose, make sure I move all attributes in the new composition, and being a good artist, I should rename the composition, and I'll call it Painted Stabilized. Not a great name, but it will do. So this is my Painted Stabilized. I'll double-click to open that up. And this is the footage. Okay? And I want to get rid of that second corner pin. I'll just turn this off for now. So we just have, make sure I've turned off the right one, which I have. We just have the stabilized footage here. And what this allows me to do now is mask this footage off. So I'm only grabbing the sections where I painted out the markers. So I'll go to frame 16 and I'll temporarily disable paint so I can see where the markers are, obviously. And what I want to do now is go back to my source, and I'm going to create masks just around those 4 areas. So I'll zoom in. Let's just go to say 200% so we're nice and accurate. And with the layer selected here, I'm going to grab my pen tool, drag a fairly generous border because I want a lot of fall off, and I'm including some of the healthy original pixels, not just the marker I'm trying to remove. All right, there's 1, there's 2. Now the reason once I close the shape that everything else isn't disappearing is simply because I have that duplicated layer underneath that we're still seeing. Okay, all 4 done. And if I now go ahead and hit the feather, I can make feather adjustments, but I should actually look at my paint work first. So I'll come back into the other comp that I pre-comped, and I'll re-enable paint. So let's go back into the source comp. You'll see, bang, all the markers disappear. And now I need to figure out how much I need to feather. This should be, I think, mask 4. So if I go too far, oh, that was mask 4 on the right. If I go too far, I'm going to reveal back the original marker. But it looks like probably around 8 pixels of feather will be enough just to blend in the edges without re-exposing the markers. Okay, now if we were to jump to another frame right now, we're going to get this because we still haven't reintroduced the motion to this layer. And to make sure the mask gets tracked with everything else, we have to do one more pre-comp. So I'm going to select this thing that we've already pre-composed once, Control-Shift-C to pre-compose it again, and we'll just call this Final Paint. Click OK, and we can just go back to our other layer, the one that we duplicated the original stabilized layer from, and we will apply another corner pin. Again, we want it to be a match move this time to introduce the movement that we removed, but we're applying it to the pre-comp of the pre-comp at this point, and so all of the hard work we've done in painting out and masking off will be tracked in. So we need to apply export to the final paint layer, apply the export, that corner pin's now applied, and the paint should now move wherever the phone moves. And we've now painted out our markers while still preserving reflections, and even though we'll get a little bit of weirdness sometimes with the cloning of the reflections, once we get the screen over, it'll look very natural. So it's finally time to add our graphic. I'm going to go ahead and bring that in. I have this little animation I just grabbed from the web as an example. I just need to interpret the footage, make sure it's set to the same frame rate. Drop frame 24. Before we drop this in, we're going to create a layer that matches the comp size. So new, solid, make comp size, should be defaulting. Click OK. That comes in, and we will go ahead and bring our iPhone animation in. We're just going to pre-compose those two elements. Control-Shift-C, and this is iPhone graphic. Okay. And if we double-click to open that up, let's just turn off the white solid for now. And first thing I want to do is get the timing set. So right when the finger touches the iPhone, right here at 2 seconds, 2 frames, that's where we want the graphic to change. So I'm going to go to the iPhone graphic and shuffle it down the timeline until we get to the point at which it starts to change. And I'm going to press Control-Alt-T or Command-Option-T on a Mac. And that opens up time remapping. And now that I've got those timings correct, I just want to copy the first remap keyframe and Control-V paste it to the beginning. Then Alt left square bracket to move this back to the first frame. That would be Option left bracket on a Mac. And now if we go back to the iPhone graphic section, we can select the layer and press Control-Alt-F. And that will force this thing to resize to the full frame, which looks ridiculous here. But if we go back into the main comp, we can now go to the original source layer, and in the effects, in Mocha, we now want to apply the corner pin with the match move, so we leave it not inverted. We leave the invert unchecked. And we apply it to the iPhone graphic layer. Apply, export. And now if we go to frame 16, everything should be normal. It's all fully lined up. So the last step here is to add an additional corner pin to our iPhone graphic that will do the initial lineup of the graphic. So you see, this is the one that's going to be used to match move all the changes. And we're going to add one corner pin just above it to actually align the initial position of the graphic. So we're going to go to, with the iPhone graphic comp selected, Effect, Distort, Corner Pin. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned, going back to the Mocha, we actually should have set export option to corner pin support motion blur and then apply export. So now I need to go back into my iPhone graphic and I want to get rid of the original one here. I should have had that set to support motion blur before I did that. And we can just verify actually at a frame where there's movement that if I now turn on motion blur, we actually see it. It's a little subtle right now, but you can see this. These edges just got motion blurred when I enabled it for the layer. So let's go back to frame 16 where that should have no effect, but with our new corner pin here, it's called corner pin 2. In fact, I'm going to hit enter to rename it to adjust graphic underscore cpin so we don't get confused. And let me just turn the transparency down for a little bit so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to click upper left and select the upper left of the phone, upper right, lower left, and lower right. Now that I got them close, I can zoom in. And what I want to do, because this includes the bezel, is have this so that it appears to be the entire outside of the phone. And that should be good. We can tweak a little bit later. Now, we do get subpixel softening by doing 2 corner pins on the one thing, but because we're starting off with a really wide frame, we should only get a little bit of softening, and it should be less than what we have to deal with in terms of softening the image to match the softness of the background anyway. All right, so one of the big reasons that a lot of people's screen inserts look fake is because they leave their compositing right here with a standard normal blend mode. By the way, if you can't see the blend mode, right-click and choose Columns, Modes. Okay, just right-click on the header for all of the layers up here and make sure Modes is selected so you can see it. This is the wrong method for comping. Now, if you have one of the ugly green screen inserts, you'll have to use that method. But in this case, because we have these nice screen reflections, the correct choice is additive, add. And what this does is simply add the pixel brightnesses of the graphic to the existing ones. Now that we've done that, we can play with the opacity, and you'll see right now at 0 opacity, whoops, you can actually see the reflection. And by adding to the reflection, what we're doing is guaranteeing that the black level matches the real scene. See, any kind of device can only be as dark as the screen appears when turned off. So this is not pure black. It's very rare to have 000 as a black in a live action image. So this is our black level, and we're just adding to it. And we don't want to set 100% opacity. We just want to bring the opacity up until we feel like the screen intensity matches what the iPhone would be projecting on the day. We'll add a little bit of defocus. So we're going to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Camera Lens Blur. And that's way too much, obviously, the default. Let's try 0.8. All right, let's deal with the case of the ghostly fingers here. So what we want to do is rotoscope out these fingers. Now, you may be tempted, if you look at the source footage, let me just deselect these other layers, to just Luma key it. And that can work, but honestly, you can have all kinds of problems with subtle details, like here in the fingernails. It's not really a good idea because the roto is so easy to do in this case that it's almost silly not to take advantage of it. So we're going to create a shape layer. So we'll go Layer, New Shape Layer, and we can draw a shape. And I want to go through kind of right in the middle of the transparent section here. Again, you want to be at the reference frame, and I set that at frame 16 so that everything just kind of works nicely. And I'll just close out here. So there's my hideous, ugly shape, but it should do the job. We're going to now pre-compose that. So Control-Shift-C to pre-compose. Call this Finger Roto Comp. And now that that's in a pre-comp, I can go ahead and apply our tracking data. Again, I'm going to be at frame 16 and go back to the Mocha for our bottom layer here. And I'm going to apply to the Finger Roto Comp another copy of the non-inverted tracking data. Frame 16, nothing should happen, but hopefully you'll find that those fingers now move along. So we'll need to make some minor tweaks, but for the most part, we should be good. To make those tweaks, first of all, we actually need to set this up as a track mat for our graphic. So we'll select the graphic, and in the track mat column, again, if you don't see that, right-click on the header and choose Columns Modes. And here in the track mat for the iPhone graphic, the finger roto has to be directly above it. We're going to choose Alpha Inverted Mat. So it's going to cut out those fingers. And we're still seeing a little bit of black around here, but that's just because we haven't added any blur to our shape. So I'm going to double click. Oh, first of all, we will go ahead and lock the composition screen. And now if we double click the finger roto comp, it'll open up a separate window, and if I grab the header of the tab and drag it over to here, we can split these guys and have access to our shape while we look at the results. So let's add a blur to this shape layer. Effect, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we'll crank that up until it looks fairly natural for the shot. That looks about right for the shot. This finger looks like it needs a little bit of work, so we can make sure we're in the Select tool, double click the outline, and then just make a few adjustments to the shape edge here. Once you're happy with your initial roto, you need to set a keyframe for the shape, and then typically you go forward or backwards 4, 6, or 8 frames. I'll go forward 6 in this one, and we look and you see, of course, because of the perspective shift, there's been a shifting, so we'll just go and update our roto. Then we step back halfway in between, in this case 3 frames, and make any tweaks we need to just fix any drift, and we check the other frames in between. Alright, I'll just quickly go in and fix the graphic bezel here. So that's in our iPhone graphic layer, and we just want to create a quick mask for this layer. And we'll add a little bit of feather to that. Much better. We can see we need to make a little bit of adjustment to the left side, certainly, of this graphic. It's not quite positioned right. So with that, we can do that with the initial adjust corner pin. So I'm going to select that. We're almost done. Let's look at the story so far. Let's actually turn on motion blur for the graphic layer. All right, not too bad. We still have a little bit of tweaking to do. Obviously, the biggest thing left is that finger. So let's go ahead and deal with that. So, of course, the last step is to roto this finger coming in, and it's a very quick and easy roto. So I'm not going to waste time on that, and I cheated and just grabbed, created some roto and baked it out just so I can drop it in here. I'll take the original footage I have at the bottom, duplicate it, and just drag it underneath that new roto. And I'll say use alpha track mat of that roto. Bang. And now we have our finger happily back in place over the screen. And let's take a look at the final shot.